The morning of April 5, 1943, arrived over Tunisia with the kind of crystalline clarity that made aerial combat both beautiful and terrible. Oberleutnant Klaus Werner sat in the cramped cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, 23,000 feet above the tan and olive patchwork of North Africa, watching the horizon with the practiced eye of a pilot who had survived 18 months of war. Below him, somewhere in that vast expanse, American bombers were making their way toward Axis positions. His orders were simple: intercept and destroy. What Werner could not have known, what none of the German pilots climbing into the thin air that morning could have anticipated, was that they were about to encounter an aircraft that would fundamentally challenge everything they had been taught about aerial combat. The Americans called it the Lightning. Within hours, German pilots would have another name for it entirely. Werner had heard rumors, of course. Strange, twin-boomed fighters had appeared in the theater months earlier, ungainly things that looked more like reconnaissance aircraft than fighters. Some pilots claimed they were dangerous. Others laughed. How could any twin-engine aircraft, burdened with the weight and complexity of two motors, hope to compete with the sleek, proven designs of the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighters? The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10, Germany's own twin-engine fighter, had proven a disappointment in combat against nimbler opponents. Why should the American version be any different? The answer came at 12,000 feet, traveling at over 400 miles per hour. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the shock that German pilots experienced when they first encountered the P-38 Lightning in serious numbers, one must first understand the world they inhabited in early 1943. The Luftwaffe, despite mounting losses on the Eastern Front and growing Allied air superiority over Germany itself, still maintained an aura of technical and tactical superiority. German pilot training, while beginning to compress under the pressures of war, remained thorough. Young men like Werner spent hundreds of hours mastering the characteristics of their aircraft before ever seeing combat. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, in its various iterations, had been the backbone of German fighter operations since the Spanish Civil War. By 1943, the G model, or Gustav, dominated production. With its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing up to 1,400 horsepower, the Bf 109G could reach speeds approaching 390 miles per hour in level flight. It could climb rapidly, maneuver tightly, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it remained a lethal weapon. The Focke-Wulf W190, introduced in 1941, had given German pilots an even more capable platform. Robust, well-armed, and possessing superior low-to-medium altitude performance compared to the Bf 109, the radial engine FDU 190A8 could reach speeds of 408 miles per hour. Its wide-track landing gear made it easier to handle on the ground, and its visibility from the cockpit exceeded that of the Messerschmitt. German pilots respected it as perhaps the finest air superiority fighter in the European theatre. Against these proven designs, the early reports of the P-38 seemed almost comical. The aircraft had an unusual configuration, twin booms extending back from wing-mounted engines, with the pilot sitting in a central nacelle between them. This gave it an immediately recognizable silhouette, one that some German pilots compared to their own Focke-Wulf Fallow 189 reconnaissance aircraft. The assumption, natural enough, was that the P-38 served a similar purpose: observation and photography, not combat. This assumption cost lives. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning had been designed to meet a 1937 United States Army Air Corps specification, calling for an interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, a requirement that seemed almost impossible for single-engine aircraft of that era. Lockheed's design team, led by a young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, had made a radical decision. They would use two engines. But unlike the heavy, crew-served fighters that Germany had developed, the P-38 would have just one pilot. And unlike those fighters, which sacrificed agility for endurance and firepower, the Lightning would be designed to fight. Two Allison V-1710 engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower and equipped with turbo superchargers, gave the aircraft extraordinary performance at high altitude. The turbo superchargers, mounted atop each engine, compressed thin, high-altitude air before feeding it into the engine, maintaining power output where other fighters began to gasp. This technology, still relatively rare in 1943, gave the P-38 a critical advantage in the vertical dimension of combat. The armament represented another departure from conventional design. Rather than mounting guns in the wings, where convergence issues limited effective range, Lockheed placed all weapons in the nose of the central nacelle, 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon. This concentration of firepower meant that P-38 pilots could engage targets at longer ranges with devastating effect. There was no need to worry about harmonization, the point where wing-mounted guns' fire converged. Every round the Lightning fired followed essentially the same trajectory. By April of 1943, the P-38 models arriving in North Africa, primarily the F and G, variants incorporated lessons learned from earlier combat. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced vulnerability to fire. Improved oxygen systems allowed pilots to fight effectively at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. And most importantly, American pilots were beginning to understand how to use the aircraft's unique characteristics to maximum advantage. The P-38's top speed of 414 miles per hour made it as fast or faster than any German fighter it would encounter over North Africa. But speed alone did not make a superior fighter. What made the Lightning particularly dangerous was the combination of speed, altitude, performance, range, and concentrated firepower, a package that allowed it to dictate the terms of engagement. German tactical doctrine, refined through years of combat, emphasized the advantages of altitude and position. Fighter pilots were taught to climb above their opponents, use the sun for concealment, and attack in diving passes that maximized speed and minimized exposure. The Bf-109 and FW-190 both excelled at this style of combat. Their relatively light wing loading and powerful engines allowed them to turn tightly and climb rapidly after an attack. But these tactics presumed an opponent who could not match German fighters in speed or altitude. The P-38 challenged that presumption. When Oberleutnant Werner first saw the P-38s that April morning, they appeared as small silver crosses against the pale sky, perhaps 8 of them flying in loose formation above and behind the American bomber stream. His initial thought was tactical: split his swarm, attack from different angles, use superior numbers to overwhelm the escorts. Standard procedure. What happened next would be discussed in Luftwaffe ready rooms for months afterward. The Lightning pilots saw the German fighters climbing toward them and made a decision that seemed counterintuitive to Werner. Instead of turning to meet the threat defensively, they attacked. All 8 P-38s rolled into steep dives, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes growing rapidly larger as they accelerated toward the Messerschmitts. Werner had fought American fighters before P-40 Warhawks and more recently P-39 Airacobras. Both could be dangerous in the right circumstances, but both had limitations that a skilled German pilot could exploit. The P-40 was slower and less maneuverable at altitude. The P-39 suffered from poor high-altitude performance and dangerous handling characteristics. Werner expected the twin-engine Americans to be even more cumbersome. He was about to learn otherwise. The lead P-38 opened fire at a range Werner initially thought was far too great, perhaps 800 yards. At that distance, most fighters' wing-mounted guns produced a dispersed pattern that made hits unlikely, but the Lightning's nose-mounted weapons created a concentrated stream of fire that forced Werner to brake hard right, abandoning his attack run. As he pulled into the turn, pulling nearly 6 times the force of gravity against his body and vision graying at the edges, he caught a glimpse of the P-38 flashing past, not struggling to follow his maneuver, but continuing its dive with terrifying speed. And then it was climbing again. This was the tactical revelation that German pilots struggled to counter. The P-38 could execute high-speed passes that few aircraft could match. Its dive speed exceeded that of the Bf-109 and FW-190. and its ability to recover from those dives and climb back to altitude meant that Lightning pilots could engage, disengage, and re-engage almost at will. Hans Joachim Marseille, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots before his death in September 1942, had pioneered tactics based on precise deflection, shooting, and extreme maneuverability. His Bf 109 could outturn almost any Allied fighter in the Mediterranean theatre, but the P-38 didn't need to turn with its opponents. It could strike from above, accelerate away in a dive that German fighters dared not follow at maximum speed, and climb back to altitude before German pilots could reposition. The combat that morning over Tunisia lasted perhaps 6 minutes. When it ended, 12 German fighters had been reduced to 7. The P-38 formation remained intact, shepherding its bombers toward their target, while German pilots, low on fuel and ammunition, withdrew to their bases. Werner landed his Bf 109 at Gabes with a new respect for the twin-boomed American fighter. In the debriefing that followed, he and his fellow pilots tried to articulate what had happened. The Lightnings had been faster than expected. Their concentrated firepower had been deadly. Their ability to fight at high altitude had negated one of the Luftwaffe's traditional advantages. And most disturbing of all, the American pilots had fought with a level of aggression and coordination that suggested thorough training and growing confidence. One pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, put it simply, "They can do everything we can do, but they can do it farther from home." The range issue was perhaps the most strategically significant aspect of the P-38's design. With internal fuel tanks, the Lightning could fly roughly 1,300 miles, more than twice the range of a Bf 109. With external drop tanks, that range extended to well over 1,500 miles. This meant P-38 pilots could escort bombers deep into Axis territory, fight extended engagements, and still return to base with fuel to spare. For German pilots, already stretched thin across multiple theatres, this presented an impossible problem. They had to intercept heavily armed bombers while simultaneously fending off fighter escorts that could remain over the target area for extended periods. Fuel limitations meant German fighters typically had 30 minutes or less to engage before they had to withdraw. The Americans could stay for hours. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German pilots had been trained to think of themselves as members of an elite force equipped with superior technology. The appearance of an American fighter that matched or exceeded German aircraft in nearly every performance metric forced a fundamental re-evaluation of that assumption. After April 5, 1943, the day 26, P-38Fs claimed 31 enemy aircraft destroyed over Tunisia. German intelligence began compiling detailed reports on the Lightning. These reports noted the aircraft's strengths and, importantly, its weaknesses. The early models suffered from compressibility issues in high-speed dives, with controls becoming heavy or even locking up as airspeed approached the speed of sound. The cockpit's heating system proved inadequate at high altitudes, particularly in the cold skies over northern Europe. And the aircraft's size and distinctive silhouette made it easy to spot from long distances. Luftwaffe instructors began teaching specific tactics for engaging the P-38, attack from below and behind, exploiting the blind spot created by the Lightning's twin-boom configuration. Force them into slow-speed turning fights, where the Bf 109 and FW 190 retained advantages. Above all, avoid extended climbing engagements where the P-38's turbo-supercharged engines gave it superior performance. But knowledge of weaknesses and the ability to exploit them were two different things. The tactics that might work in theory often proved difficult to execute in the chaos of actual combat. And as 1943 progressed, the quality of American pilots continued to improve, while German pilot training, pressured by mounting losses and fuel shortages, began to deteriorate. Oberleutnant Klaus Werner would encounter P-38s again many times before the North African campaign ended in May 1943. Some engagements went better than others. He learned to watch for the telltale glint of sunlight on aluminum. Many Lightnings flew in their natural metal finish, making them visible from great distances. He learned to listen to his wingman's warnings, to position himself carefully before committing to an attack. He survived, but many did not. The P-38, initially dismissed as an ungainly oddity, had proven itself a formidable opponent. The fork-tailed devil, as German soldiers allegedly called it, though whether this nickname originated from genuine fear or Allied propaganda remains debated, had changed the calculus of aerial combat over the Mediterranean. The evolution of German understanding regarding the P-38 Lightning occurred in stages, each marked by encounters that stripped away another layer of assumption about American industrial and engineering capability. What had begun as dismissive curiosity transformed into wary respect, and ultimately, for some pilots, into something approaching dread. By summer of 1943, as Allied forces invaded Sicily and pushed into mainland Italy, the P-38 had become a common sight in Mediterranean skies. Luftwaffe pilots learned to recognize its distinctive profile from miles away, a characteristic that cut both ways. While early warning of lightning formations allowed German fighters to prepare, it also meant that bomber crews knew help was nearby. The mere presence of P-38s often caused German fighter formations to reconsider their attack plans. Oberst Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, commanding fighters from bases in Sicily, recorded his impressions of combat against the Lightning. His experience was particularly valuable because Steinhoff was no novice. He had fought in the Battle of Britain and on the Eastern Front, accumulating victories against some of the war's finest pilots. His assessment of the P-38 carried weight precisely because it came from a position of extensive combat experience. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Steinhoff noted that in his Bf-109, he could sometimes match the Lightning's speed in level flight, but the American fighter could turn more tightly and establish a firing position with unsettling rapidity. Other German pilots reported that the P-38's guns seemed more powerful than their own, though Steinhoff considered this an exaggeration. What wasn't exaggerated was the effect of having 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon all firing from a single point. The concentration of fire created a devastating cone of destruction that required less precision than wing-mounted weapons. But perhaps the most revealing comment came from Luftwaffe ace Hans Pilcher, who had accumulated 75 confirmed victories by the time he encountered his first Lightning. In a letter home, later captured and translated, Pilcher described attempting a stern attack on what he presumed was a reconnaissance aircraft. "I positioned myself perfectly," he wrote, "checked my range, and prepared to fire. One moment it was there in my gun sight, the next it was gone, climbing away at an angle and speed I could not match. We were left with our mouths wide open. This wasn't magic, though it might have seemed so in the moment. What Pilcher had encountered was a well-trained P-38 pilot executing a maneuver that exploited the Lightning's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude and its rapid acceleration. Characteristics: the turbo-supercharged Allison engines maintained their power output in thin air, where German fighters began to struggle. A Lightning pilot under attack could push his throttles forward, pull back on the yoke, and simply climb away from danger provided he had sufficient altitude to begin with. The vertical dimension of combat had always been critical in fighter tactics. The pilot who controlled altitude controlled the engagement. But the P-38's ability to climb rapidly, even at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet, meant that Lightning pilots could recover the altitude advantage even after defensive maneuvering. German pilots, accustomed to opponents who weakened as altitude increased, found this deeply frustrating. Technical reports flowing back to Luftwaffe headquarters in Germany painted an increasingly concerning picture. American fighters were not only matching German performance but, in some metrics, exceeding it. The P-38J model, entering service in spring of 1944, incorporated numerous improvements over earlier variants. Upgraded engines produced 1,475 horsepower each. New chin radiators, under the engines, improved cooling efficiency. Electrically heated flight suits addressed the cockpit heating problems that had plagued earlier Lightnings in the cold European theatre. Most significantly, the J and later L models incorporated dive flaps, small surfaces, that extended under the wings during high-speed dives, to control airflow and prevent compressibility issues. This modification addressed one of the P-38's few significant weaknesses. Earlier models could encounter severe buffeting and control problems in dives, approaching Mach 6 to 8, sometimes losing control entirely. German pilots had learned that they could escape Lightning attacks by initiating steep dives, knowing the American pilots would be reluctant to follow. The dive flaps changed this equation. A P-38J could now follow German fighters into high-speed dives with greater safety, eliminating an escape route that had saved many German lives. Horst Petzschler of Jagdgeschwader 3, flying Bf-109s over France in 1944, noted this change with alarm. The newer Lightnings had capabilities we had not seen before, he recalled in post-war interviews. At higher altitudes they were faster and could outturn both our Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109. They were faster in dives, and now they could recover from those dives safely. Our instructors told us to exploit weaknesses that were no longer there. The industrial implications were equally sobering. By 1944, Lockheed and Consolidated Vultee were producing Lightnings at a rate that German factories could not match. More than 10,000 P-38s would ultimately be built, a production run that dwarfed that of comparable German aircraft. Each Lightning cost approximately $120,000, roughly twice the price of a P-51 Mustang, but the Army Air Forces ordered them anyway. They could afford two. This was perhaps the deepest cut to German morale, the growing realization that American industrial capacity could simply overwhelm Axis production through sheer volume. A German pilot who shot down a P-38 could expect to see two more within days. The Americans weren't just building better aircraft. They were building more of them, faster, and they had the fuel and trained pilots to put them all in the air simultaneously. Lieutenant Friedrich Haas, flying Foe 190A8s over Western Germany in late 1944, described the psychological weight of this disparity in his diary. "We scramble to intercept bomber formations," he wrote, "and there are always fighters, P-38s, P-47s, P-51s, sometimes all three types in numbers we cannot match. We fight as hard as we can, we shoot down what we can, and the next day there are more, always more. Where do they all come from?" The answer, had Haas known it, would have been even more demoralizing. American aircraft factories operated multiple shifts, 7 days a week. Trained workers, many of them women, stepping into roles traditionally reserved for men, assembled aircraft using standardized parts and assembly line methods pioneered by Henry Ford. The Willow Run plant alone could produce a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Lightning production, while more complex due to the aircraft's sophisticated systems, still vastly exceeded anything German industry could achieve under constant Allied bombing. But industrial statistics meant little in the cockpit of a fighter at 25,000 feet, fuel running low, ammunition expended, and enemy aircraft still filling the sky. For German pilots, the immediate reality was simpler and more brutal. They were being overwhelmed. The specific combat encounter that perhaps best illustrates the P-38's impact occurred on May 20th, 1944, near Steinharder Lake in northwestern Germany. Lieutenant Joseph Garnett, flying a P-38J with the 338th Fighter Squadron, spotted a formation of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters attempting to intercept American bombers. One Lightning in Garnett's flight broke left, pursued by an FW-190 that had gained a brief advantage. Garnett positioned his aircraft behind the German fighter and waited for the right moment. The Focke-Wulf pilot, sensing danger, attempted his standard escape maneuver, a steep, near-vertical dive from 28,000 feet. In earlier months, this would have worked. The pursuing Lightning pilot would have broken off, unwilling to risk compressibility lockup. But Garnett's P-38J had dive flaps. He followed the FW-190 down through 25,000 feet, through 20,000, accelerating smoothly while maintaining full control. At 15,000 feet, the German pilot attempted to pull out, but the forces involved were enormous. The Focke-Wulf's controls had become heavy in the dive, responsive but requiring strength that bordered on superhuman at such speeds. Garnett pulled his trigger at 8,000 feet. The concentrated fire from his nose-mounted guns struck the Fail-190 along the fuselage and wing route. The German aircraft shuddered. Then its dive steepened beyond any possibility of recovery. It struck the earth near the lake at a shallow angle, creating a long scar in a farmer's field. Garnett pulled out of his dive at 2,000 feet, his Lightning responding smoothly despite an indicated airspeed that had briefly touched 450 miles per hour. He experienced some buffeting at the bottom of his pullout, the aircraft vibrating as turbulent air flowed over the wings, but the dive flaps had done their job. Control was maintained. The Lightning climbed back toward the bomber stream, where the mission continued. Other American pilots that day reported similar experiences. P-38. Formations from multiple squadrons pursued German fighters through dives that started at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. Some Lightning pilots reported buffeting at speeds approaching Mach .675, but unlike the earlier models, the J and L variants could recover. The modification that had seemed minor hydraulically operated flaps under the wings had eliminated one of the Lightning's few exploitable weaknesses. For German pilots who had relied on diving away from danger, this development was catastrophic. Luftwaffe pilot reports from spring and summer 1944 increasingly noted that American fighters, particularly P-38s and P-47s, could pursue them through maneuvers that should have been safe. The sky, which had once offered multiple escape routes, was shrinking. The psychological transformation that German pilots underwent mirrors a pattern seen throughout the war. Initial confidence based on proven designs and tactics, followed by growing unease as Allied equipment improved, and finally a kind of fatalistic acceptance that they were fighting with inadequate resources against an opponent with seemingly limitless industrial capacity. This transformation was particularly pronounced with the P-38 because the aircraft's appearance was so distinctive. Unlike the P-51 Mustang, which resembled other single-engine fighters at a distance, or the P-47 Thunderbolt, which could be mistaken for a Fevu-190 in poor visibility, the twin-boom Lightning was unmistakable. German pilots couldn't tell themselves they were facing a lesser opponent. They knew exactly what they were up against. The nickname Der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil that supposedly originated from a captured German pilot in North Africa in 1943, whether genuine or Allied propaganda, captured something real about German perceptions of the aircraft. The P-38 was different. It looked different, it fought differently, and it represented a different philosophy of aircraft design. Use multiple engines not to create a heavy, crew-served platform, but to give a single-seat fighter capabilities that exceeded traditional single-engine limitations. By late 1944, the air war over Europe had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots and capable aircraft, but fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the sheer volume of Allied air power made sustained resistance impossible. German fighters that took off to intercept bomber formations faced not just the bombers themselves, each bristling with defensive guns, but also multiple fighter types flying escort. The P-38, while eventually supplemented and partially replaced by the longer-range P-51 Mustang in the European theatre, remained a potent weapon throughout the war. In the Pacific, where its range and twin-engine reliability proved even more valuable than in Europe, the Lightning dominated Japanese opposition. American ace Richard Bong scored all 40 of his victories, flying P-38s. Thomas Maguire, the second highest-scoring American ace, achieved 38 kills in Lightnings. Charles MacDonald added 27 more. These numbers represented more than personal achievements. They demonstrated that in the hands of well-trained pilots, the P-38 could compete with any fighter in the world. The twin-engine configuration that had initially prompted skepticism proved to be an advantage, not a liability. Two engines meant redundancy. A Lightning could lose one engine and still return to base. Two turbo superchargers meant exceptional high-altitude performance. The unconventional layout meant concentrated firepower and excellent visibility. For the German pilots who survived the war, their memories of combat against the Lightning remained vivid. In post-war interviews and memoirs, many acknowledged the aircraft's capabilities, with a mixture of professional respect and personal relief that the war had ended. The P-38 had forced them to rethink assumptions about twin-engine fighters, about American engineering, and ultimately about the nature of the conflict itself. The Lightning that had seemed impossible, a twin-engine fighter that could outperform single-engine opponents, had proven all too real. German pilots had learned, through bitter experience, that underestimating American technology and industrial capacity was a potentially fatal mistake. The fork-tailed aircraft that they had initially dismissed as too heavy, too complex, too strange to be effective, had helped establish Allied air superiority over two continents. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the P-38's combat record spoke for itself. The Lightning had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter. It had served as a bomber escort deep into enemy territory, a fighter bomber attacking ground targets, a reconnaissance platform capturing images that shaped Allied strategy, and even a pathfinder leading other aircraft to their targets through clouds and darkness. The final tally, more than 10,000 P-38s produced, flying more than 130,000 missions in theaters around the world. The aircraft that German pilots had laughed at in early 1943 had become one of the war's most versatile and effective fighters. Klaus Werner, the Oberleutnant who had first encountered P-38s over Tunisia in April 1943, survived the war. In a memoir written decades later, he reflected on that first engagement and the many that followed. "We thought we knew what to expect," he wrote. "We had fought the British, the Russians, and the Americans before. We believed our aircraft were superior, our tactics proven, our training thorough. The Lightning taught us that war is fought not just with courage and skill, but with industrial capacity and technological innovation. The Americans had both, and they had them in quantities we could not match. The twin-engine fighter we mocked became the symbol of that reality. It could go faster, fly higher, reach farther, and fight harder than we expected. And there were always more of them." The story of the P-38 Lightning and its impact on German pilots reveals a fundamental truth about the Second World War. Technological advantage, when combined with industrial capacity and trained personnel, could overcome even the most skilled and determined opposition. The aircraft that had seemed impossible, too heavy, too complex, too unconventional, had helped win the war in the air. For German pilots who faced it, the Lightning represented more than just another enemy aircraft. It represented the collision between what they had been taught to believe about their own superiority and the material reality of American power. The speed that left them helpless to react wasn't just about miles per hour or engine horsepower. It was about the speed at which American industry could produce aircraft, train pilots, and project power across oceans to battlefields on multiple continents. The fork-tailed devil had indeed lived up to its name, not through supernatural power, but through the very earthly advantages of sound engineering, mass production, and strategic vision. The Germans had been taught that twin-engine fighters were inherently inferior to single-engine designs. The P-38 proved that assumption wrong, one combat engagement at a time. In the end, the Lightning's greatest achievement may have been psychological as much as tactical. It forced Axis pilots to confront the reality that Allied technology was not just competitive but, in many cases, superior. And behind that technology stood factories that could outproduce anything Germany or Japan could build, training programs that could prepare pilots faster than the Axis could replace losses, and a strategic commitment to winning the war regardless of the cost. The impossible speed that left German pilots helpless to react was ultimately the speed of American industrial and military mobilization, a force that, once fully engaged, proved unstoppable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.